Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Benson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a senior studying communication in peace and justice studies. Today, I'll be discussing my senior thesis research, The Disinvention of Black Women, a rhetorical analysis of intersectional oppression within the cosmetics industry. I've been advised by Dr. Billie Murray throughout this process, and Dr. Terry Nance has served as my thesis reader. My interest in cosmetics began in my youth as I was trying to find myself and express my identity through cosmetics. However, it was not until a couple of years ago that I became interested in the rhetorics of cosmetics, more specifically, interested in shade names and how they seem to represent Black women in edible ways. And so my research this past year has been guided by several questions, but the most important has been how do rhetorical meaning structures within the cosmetics industry serve to reproduce racialized and gendered intersectional discourses that negatively impact Black women? And more specifically, to what extent are non-white women disproportionately impacted by these naming practices within the cosmetics industry? And so I've grounded my rhetorical criticism in a Black feminist approach. And I've worked to highlight the perspectives of Black women and women of color by disrupting meaning making practices that have long neglected our experiences. As a biracial woman, BFT has offered me a critical lens to engage in challenging oppressive practices in my own life. And so this semester, I engaged in rhetorical analysis and analyzed and coded 6 different rhetorical artifacts. 3 represent mainstream brands at different price points that offer inclusive shade ranges. And the remaining 3 are Black-centric brands that privilege Afrocentricity and Black beauty. And through my research, I've drawn connections between micro reproductions of oppression in the cosmetics industry with kind of broader systems of oppression that impact Black women. More specifically, I've sought to understand the relationship between the rhetorical constitution of Black women as consumable, edible, and sinful, and the narrative and historical trend of Black female unrapeability. I've done so through a rhetorical lens because language and its associated meanings have real power that are worthy of academic inquiry. And so now I'd like to share some of my key findings. Through my coding process, I've identified 4 key themes that speak to this relationship. The first is women as flawed, and I found that foundation shade descriptions construct arguments that women are flawed and are in need of a change or fixing in order to be more beautiful and confident. And although this messaging is toward all women, I found that some women are considered more flawed than others based on racial lines. Which brings me to my next theme. Across all 3 mainstream brands and one of the Black-centric brands, I found that cosmetics companies are establishing whiteness as normative through their meaning-making practices. Their definitions of whiteness are ones that speak to traditional femininity in the cult of womanhood, and those who fail to meet its requirements are considered less feminine and less of a woman. To be a woman, you must fit certain qualities, and often these qualities are considered white. For example, Wet n Wild and L'Oreal both associate light and medium shades with the word natural. Across all 6 brands I reviewed, not one dark shade features the word natural to describe it. And so to associate white and light shades with the word natural is to align them with that which is innate or inherent. And the fact that not once are Black women considered natural marginalizes us. It means that Black women are somehow unnatural, and to see a Black woman as unnatural is to associate us with abnormality. And so this constructs beauty as something that only white women can have. If femininity is considered a core aspect of womanhood and only white women are considered feminine, then from a normative perspective, only white women are considered beautiful. And so across all 6 brands, I found also a common relationship between women being depicted as nature. However, the ways in which white and non-white women are described are in starkly different terms. I found that white women are more likely to be associated with soft, feminine, and fragile aspects of nature, such as roses, pearls, and shells. And this quality of fragility denigrates white women as weak in some respects, but it also reinforces the idea of traditional white femininity. Women of color were far more likely to be associated with harsh and tough aspects of nature, like mahogany or copper or amber. And in doing so, we've now framed Black women as more sturdy and tough. And this aligns with a rhetorical defeminization of Black women that masculinizes us by associating with us with the historical image of the brutish slave or the tough female slave laborer. And consequently, Black women have not been seen as vulnerable or soft, but instead as tough enough to handle hard work or even pain and violence. And so my final theme looks at the relationship between Blackness and food, one that has always been tenuous when we consider the stereotypical images of minstrel culture and the ways in which Black foods are considered overindulgent and excessively comforting. Well, the ways in which cosmetics companies associate Black complexions with food is no different. Black women are routinely labeled toffee, caramel, and rich Java. And these kinds of labels associate Black women with that which is sinful and too sweet to eat on a normal basis. So to indulge in a Black woman is to consume something that surpasses the everyday. It's a treat that is excessive in nature. And in this way, Black women have rhetorically become excessive. The association with Black women and spices also presents a connection to exoticization and fetishization of Black femininity. Estee Lauder, among other brands, associates Blackness with unrefined foods, such as spices like nutmeg and cinnamon. And to see a Black woman as unrefined is to align her with primitivity and savagery in opposition to the classic civilized white woman. Further, Black women are also associated with the exotic through language like deep spice, which highlights not only the richness of Black femininity, but also the spicy qualities of our culture, such as our exotic origins and presumably backwards cultural traditions. And so to symbolically associate Black women with spices, desserts, and sweets is to categorically dehumanize us while also reinforcing our perceived hypersexualization. And so through this language, Black women have become ripe for consumption. And so what does this mean in the larger context of the intersectional oppression that Black women experience? Well, the language that appears in foundation shade ranges reproduces and appropriates a historical trend that deems Black women as less feminine and exotic sexual beings. This discourse contributes to the historical trend of Black female unrapeability. What I mean by this is that Black women have consistently been rendered exotic hypersexual beings, and this assumption that we are inherently sexual in nature implies that we are perpetually available to sexual partners, that we are always wanting. And by making this assumption, we allow violence against Black women to be taken less seriously. When we frame Black women as harsh or tough aspects of nature, we invalidate the pain Black women experience, and this allows acts of violence, domestic, sexual, and otherwise, against us to seem excusable. And so through my research, I found that we as Black women need to redefine what Black womanhood means. And this means we need to redefine ourselves. Through my analysis, I have found that Black-centric brands have worked to create more rhetorically productive spaces for women of color to see ourselves represented in the industry. The most common attempt is a choice to flip the shade spectrum to privilege Blackness as the norm. And this is extremely common in the cosmetics industry to organize shades from lightest to darkest. And so in an attempt to subvert this norm, to privilege Blackness, two of the Black-centric brands I analyzed, Juvia's Place and Uoma Beauty, flip the spectrum. So when you search for your shade, you always start from the darkest shade to the lightest, descending toward the lightest. Juvia's Place also stands out due to its unique rhetoric, which associates women with nations, cities, and places. And The rhetorical strategy of the brand redefines femininity as something that is actionable and mobile rather than passive and inanimate. They assert that women, and in particular women of color, should be understood as mobile, as jet setting, as active agents of culture and history. And this work, which may seem superficially insignificant, has real power in interrogating the controlling images that have fixed Black femininity through the white gaze. And so, for us to truly define ourselves in our own womanhood, we have to do so on our own terms. And this often means operating outside of the dominant rhetorical discourse to reclaim our bodies. Thank you all for taking time to learn more about my research. I would love to take any questions now.
Thank you, Chloe. So we have questions coming in. So did you find any examples of mainstream makeup companies that did not center whiteness, or at least did not follow and reinforce harmful tropes?
No, unfortunately, in my research. I think that the most comparable example of a mainstream company that maybe isn't following this rhetoric would be ones that don't necessarily subscribe to the kind of descriptive practices that I was talking about, and instead use a numerical system to kind of define the foundation shades. So that would mean privileging or specifically talking about undertones, right? So whether you are cool, neutral, warm, and then kind of numerically going from 100 to 400 or something like that to discuss what a shade kind of looks like. And I think that when you think of mainstream brands, you primarily think of I think really popular ones like L'Oreal, Revlon, like major corporations. And so you just don't see them really doing that numerical system. I think they really still subscribe to the original, I think, kind of normative system that uses the same kind of descriptive practices that I've discussed. But I think that more companies are moving toward that numerical system that I'm talking about. So I think some people may even consider now brands like Fenty Beauty, which is founded by Rihanna, to be somewhat mainstream or coming into the mainstream. And brands like Fenty do use a numerical system to talk about shade ranges. And I think that is far less harmful than I think trying to subscribe to a practice that associates women with nature, associates Black women with harsh aspects of nature. And so I think that is the one example I've seen of brands not necessarily going with this kind of practice.
Okay. There was another question, which was, have you also looked at visual representations?
Not as much necessarily. I'm assuming when she's talking about visual representation, she's talking about like advertising and marketing practices. And I think because I had to really focus and narrow in my my research on something really kind of specific to just get it done in a full year, I specifically focused on the language. And I was really, I think, my initial interest was in the kind of actual language practices and how they appropriated a larger oppressive discourse. And so that was, I think, my primary interest. But I think that there is definitely opportunity to extend this research to focusing on visual representations as well. I didn't focus on that primarily.
So on a good follow-up question is, do you know if advertising companies are taking any action towards changing their language?
Yes. I think that they are moving toward it in the last year or so, in recognizing that they've used harmful language like skin whitening in their products. And that is, I think, extreme examples of them utilizing really harmful rhetoric that is harmful to Black and brown women. But I don't think that they see this kind of rhetoric as harmful because it is so normative and it seems so ordinary to, pick up your foundation shade that's cashmere or I was just at the grocery store yesterday, and I got a concealer, and my under eye shade is called cashmere. And so it plays into, I think, a system that is privileging people with skin complexions like mine and harmful to, I think, darker complexion Black and brown women. And so I don't think that they see it as harmful because it seems so normal to I think the everyday consumer to use this kind of language. But I think that more and more people are questioning, I think, the kinds of language that they're using. One of, I think, the main kind of points of interest or initial interest that I got in this was I love YouTube gurus, makeup gurus, especially Black ones like Jackie Aina and Naima Tang. And so several years ago, they put out some videos where they were kind of just mixing basically all of these different foundation shades that were named the same thing across different kind of companies, but had totally different undertones, totally different colors, and kind of exemplified, I think, how arbitrary these naming practices are. And one of them, Jackie, said, every Black girl has gone through, a thing where she knows that her foundation shade is going to be hazelnut. We all are hazelnut. And she questioned, like, why are we always hazelnut? Like, why are we always, a dessert or a coffee or a pudding? And I think that kind of questioning is bringing about a shift in the industry. I don't think it's yet mainstream. I think it's still kind of at the margins of the discussion, but I think there has been more backlash in recent years, within the last, I'd say, like 3 to 4 years, about challenging foundation shades to be more inclusive, both in their representations of Black women, but also in the language that they use to advertise to us.
Another question, which was, this may not have been part of your research, but are there ways in which we as consumers can push mainstream brands to do better and break the harmful practice of centering on whiteness as the norm?
Yeah. First of all, I would say the point of this research is not to say that you should not buy from these brands necessarily, but more so to recognize how deeply embedded these kinds of normative frameworks are within our everyday practices. And so this is not the only industry that, these practices exist in. It's just an example of that. I think that one thing we could do as a consumer would be to start buying from Black and brown brands and make them mainstream, because the more mainstream they get, the more normative it is to privilege Black and brown skin complexions, to privilege the kind of a language that celebrates our Blackness and sees it as something to be proud of, to celebrate, rather than something to be ashamed of. And so I would say, yeah, definitely patronizing brands like Juvia's Place, like Uoma Beauty, are a really great first step. And there are tons of Black and brown cosmetics companies that, have really, really incredible practices and policies. And they're doing a lot of work to push, I think, some of your mainstream companies like Sephora and Ulta to privilege Blackness and Black consumers. And so that would be a good first step, I think, for sure, is just to buy Black. For sure. That's a really great first step.
Do you see implications or lessons from your research on cosmetics for other products that normalize whiteness as a default skin color, like Band-Aids and nylons and other consumer markets?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that what my research has primarily focused on is the language, right? So I'm focusing less on the privileging of the skin complexion as like a visual practice, and more so on the associated meaning structures and how they kind of structure our worldview and have really negative consequences on how we view Black women. But I think that when we're looking at just visual representations, right, of privileging whiteness over Black and brown skin complexions, you do see that Black and brown women are viewed more as an inconvenience to a number of industries. And so it's basically the rhetoric I think that a lot of companies put out is, well, we don't do that, like we don't privilege blackness because black people don't really buy from us, or they're not our target consumer, and that's just not true, right? Everyone needs band-aids, everyone needs stockings, and so I think that now I think brands are realizing that that's not a good excuse, and that people are more and more expecting inclusivity in their products, and expecting products that are uniquely targeted to Black and Brown consumers. But I do think when you see brands that only have, shades that are for white and light audiences, I think that reproduces the idea that we are an inconvenience as Black and Brown women, that we are an afterthought in a product. To put out a product and only first launch the light shades and then later on add the kind of end of the spectrum, is to say that, like, you weren't important enough to kind of include in the initial conversation. So I think that that's where that comes up in other industries as well.
Yeah. Your research focused on foundation. So do these issues cross over into other makeup like eyeshadow, lipstick?
Yeah. Interestingly, this kind of rhetoric that fetishizes women kind of generally does exist in other cosmetics products. So if you think like blush, NARS Cosmetics, which is a pretty popular high-end brand, they have a blush called Orgasm, and that's normal. People love that. There is a Benefit Cosmetics has a mascara called Better Than Sex. And this kind of sexualizing rhetoric is really normal in the industry. And I think that to some, it's viewed as sex positive, that we should embrace our sexuality. And I think that that is an important, I think, contribution, that we should embrace our sexuality as women and be proud of that and not shy away from that. But at the same time, it's, I think, a double-edged sword in which we are also, I think, privileging a discourse that only views us as sexual beings. And that is particularly true for Black and Brown women, that we are only seen in a very, I think, flat dynamic as only a sexual being, and there's nothing else that is relevant or important about us. And so I think that that is something that is important to consider, that we are more than just our sexuality. We are more than just sexual beings. And there are, I think, other aspects of us that are worthy of discussion and conversation and public discourse.
Mm-hmm. Apologies if I missed this. This says, but I'm curious whether alternatives to a numerical system have been considered or exist because it is still ranking skin tone.
Yeah. Like I mentioned in the presentation, I think the only other example that I have seen as in kind of a switch from the numerical system would be Black and Brown companies kind of flipping the shade spectrum to privilege Blackness as the norm. So when you go on Ulta.com and you search for your shade and for Uoma Beauty, you're going to see the darkest shades first, and they descend toward the lightest. And I think that that is the only other way, I would say, that I've seen brands kind of utilize a different practice. But I have found that, brands like Uoma Beauty are also still using the same kind of language that is harmful to Black women. So, for example, one of the shades that Uoma uses for white women is called Fair Lady. And so to be a lady means that you have to be fair. And what does that mean? That only fair women are ladies. And that really, again, goes back to a discourse that finds itself in our slavery era, where the plantation matriarchs were considered ladies, while the Black women were considered masculinized, I think, and dehumanized objects to, be used and exploited for our labor. And so I think that is there. I haven't found anything other than that. And I think that's unfortunate that we are ranking shades, but I think that starting with the darkest shade first is an important step to saying that your light complexions don't always have to be first, that we can privilege Blackness as something that is just as important as whiteness.
Do you have any thoughts about how you would share your insights and research with a wider audience?
I initially, that wasn't my intention for this project, but I'm thinking about sending my research to some of the YouTube gurus that I cite, and also some of the cosmetics companies that I discuss in this project. And so hopefully that will glean some insight for them, I think, on what I've discussed. But also in the long term, I would love to work in the cosmetics industry, or in the beauty space in general. I think that my interest in cosmetics, I started at a really young age as I was trying to, find myself, and cosmetics was, I think, an important part of my formative years. And so full circle, I think it would be really impactful for me to eventually be doing inclusion work within the industry as well, because I think that there's real power there for us to find confidence in ourselves. But I think that cosmetic companies need to be very mindful and conscious of the language that they're using to illustrate that we can be confident without our cosmetics, but there is value and in being a consumer in this industry and using products that that make us feel powerful or that make us feel enhanced and beautiful. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, I'm cognizant of the time, but I want to thank you for your excellent presentation. There are still more questions in the chat, but I do want to move on to our next scholar. So thank you very much, Chloe.
Thank you so much.